Hi all, good afternoon. Thank you for taking your time to virtually attend today's College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences Postdoctoral Fellow Seminar Series. I'm Ratih Oktarini, and today I will present my analysis on flirting, titled The Invocation of Gender as an Ingredient in the Making of Flirting. We have a nice number of audience today for a casual and intimate session, so feel free to submit your questions through the meeting chat panel on your screen, and I will answer them at the end of my presentation. A quick background information. Current presentation is an extension of my PhD project on flirting in Indonesian conversation. I completed my PhD in 2017, but since the data is fascinating, it opens up keeps opening up opportunity for me to go back and analyze them through different lenses and angles. My PhD thesis focused on sequential structure of flirting, on how flirting unfolds in talk, while touched upon some elements of categories, references, and participants' identities. While in today's presentation, I will focus on gender as one of the ingredients in flirting. Before I move on, I would like to thank all of my postdoc colleagues in CoHASS and CA Data Session Group. Without your support, today's presentation would not be possible, but all shortcomings are mine. Now let's start with what is flirting. Flirting is often discussed in overlap with courtship, romantic relationship initiation, first romantic encounter, seduction, close relationship, romantic interest, communication, etc. It has been defined in different ways. Some of them are according to Oxford English Dictionary. Flirting is behaving in such a way as to suggest a playful sexual attraction to someone. Previous studies have defined flirting as quasi-courtship, coy and less serious than courtship. So flirting is a non-serious version of courtship. But according to Downey and Vitale, flirting is also used to simply refer to courtship initiation, the initial actions one takes to convey a message of interest or attraction. So flirting can be both less serious courtship and also initiation to courtship. Now let's move slightly closer to today's presentation. The question for today's presentation is how gender is invoked in flirting. But before answering that question, let me set the background first. Why gender matters in flirting? Though the answer may be obvious to you, but just let me explain to you this way. A person may have a multitude of identities and roles in real life, but when it comes to flirting, the most important identities are their gender, male and female. They need to be a female and a male within that particular talk in order to do flirting. So they need to do something to make their gender identities, to make gender relevant in their talk in order to be able to do flirting. Let me give you an example. A female saying I like you to a male would mean different than a person saying I like you to other things, or her mother or his mother. So the gender identities need to be relevant in order for the flirting to make sense as flirting, to be identified as flirting. Now let's continue with the fun stuff, the data. The data is video and audio recorded conversation containing sequences of flirting interaction, which was serendipitously collected. The participants were not in any way asked, directed, or even hinted to flirt. They were simply told to talk to each other in front of the camera. The flirting data was part of a 6 hours conversational data collected in Bali, Indonesia. On the slide, we can see a map of Indonesia, and Bali is that tiny speck at the bottom part of the map. Back then, around 8 years ago, the aim was simply to collect video and audio data of people conversing in Indonesian language. Indonesian is the national language of our neighbor, the Republic of Indonesia, while the local language of the island is Balinese. The two languages are used actively in the island, creating a continuous language contact situation between Indonesian and Balinese. So in that note, my data may contain elements of language specific to Indonesian spoken in Bali that may not be present in conversational Indonesian of other region. So let's continue with the participants. The participants are Eva on the left and John on the right, not their real names. They are both ethnically Balinese, so some of their ideas on Male and female, and how the two genders are in sociocultural sense may be affected by their ethnical background. Eva and John are close friends. They have known each other for more than 10 years back then. Eva, on the left, the female participant, is married with a son, but her husband spent most of his time away. When the video was recorded, her husband was away. This information will become relevant in the data because the participants bring this up in their flirting interaction. There are two extra participants. They are Bev and Ron. They are the two people who set up the camera. They interact with the participants at the beginning of the recording, and then they leave the two participants alone right before they leave the two participants alone. Just a disclaimer, I do not suggest that the two participants have romantic relationship with one another. My analysis only suggests that they playfully and ambiguously display or perform what people in general would identify as sexual attraction. For some, what they do may simply be being friendly or doing banter to one another. Since today's presentation is to some extent open for public, for ethical purposes, I will not show the original video. I will only show the detailed transcript, mimic how the participants produce their utterances, and when needed, I will also show line drawings produced by tracing the still images from the video, such as the one we have on this slide. The method employed are CA or conversation analysis and membership categorization analysis or MCA. You will see my analysis will be very much based on these two approaches, but as much as possible, I avoid to use a lot of technical jargon for the two approaches so it will be more accessible. I will quickly introduce you what CA and MCA are. So they have their roots on ethnomethodology, an approach that some would characterize as a radical branch of sociology. Some of you may disagree to this characterization, and that's completely okay, because there are some other people may characterize this approach in a different way. Quoting Francis and Hester, conversation analysis or CA in short, or also called sequential analysis, is concerned with analyzing the sequential organization of talk, how one utterance or other conversational item is tied to and part of a larger sequential structure, while MCA or membership categorization analysis concerned with the organization of common sense knowledge in terms of the categories members employ in accomplishing their activities in and through talk. So CA concerns with the ordering of the talk, while MCA concerned with the use of categories in talk. So I hope you know what I'm getting on here, why I use these two approaches, because gender is a category. So CA and MCA together provide the tools to uncover how gender is used in moment by moment in the talk. Though I will try to avoid using technical jargon as much as possible, I'm going to explain some of the terms since it is unavoidable to use at least one or two in the analysis later. So let's start with the basic analytical unit of CA, the turn. The turn. People take turn to talk. A turn is marked by a speaker change. So one turn is a talk of a speaker before any speaker change happens. Here on the slide, we have Jay saying, "Let's fill the water," or "eat." It is a single turn, though it consists of more than one sentence. To be precise, one complete sentence, "Let's fill the water," and another incomplete one, "Oh, eat." But this whole "Let's fill the water," or "eat" is a single turn because there's no speaker change at that moment. The same thing goes to R's turn. R's utterances, or yeah, we call it turn. It's wonderful. It's just right. It's like bathtub water. It's a single turn as well, though we can see there are 3 sentences there. Then the 2 turns produced in sequence, J's turn and then R's turn, are called adjacency pair. What matter here? Okay, what matter here is that as a person who understands English with sufficient social interaction knowledge, we can identify R's turn as a fitting response to J's. The two turns on the slide, the adjacency pair, is the simplest form of a sequence. Some sequences may take longer time or manifested through more turns as a single task was completed through it. Flirting is a kind of sequence. How do we identify a sequence, distinguish one sequence from another? Its boundary, its character, and so on are basically some of the central endeavors in CA. Now let's continue with MCA. According to Harvey Sachs, the pioneer of this method, category is inference-rich. A great deal of the knowledge that members of a society have about the society is stored. I've shown you this image some slides before. We may recognize it as a male and female holding hands. The fact that we can readily identify this image as a male and female says something about our idea of what a male and a female should look like. We do not need the complete picture of a male and female in order to identify them as such. In addition, by looking at this picture, we get a sense that they are joining hands. By looking at them, seeing at them as joining hands, we may also infer that they have some kinds of relationship. So we may relate holding hands to couple, friends, close friends, etc. The same mechanism, inferences, also happens in talk, as we can see later in the data. The cornerstone of interaction is the ability of the participants to understand each other and then respond or react in a certain way. Much of this process comes from the process of making inference. MCA provides a tool to dissect the participants' own inferential processes through category. Now let's get on with the data. Today I will present two extracts from my flirting data. They are fascinating pieces of data since they will show us how these two participants do flirting, and especially central to today's presentation is how gender is invoked by the participants in the talk to give way for flirting. Those extracts are called nyerep, istri orang, or being a spare husband, and istri yang jablai, or lonely wife. Let's start with the first one, nyerep istri orang, or being a spare husband. This flirting sequence takes place within what we may call a parting sequence. It is when the two people who set up the recording equipment, Beth and Ron, are just about to leave the scene. This whole data was recorded in a park in Bali. The two participants were sitting in a ballet or traditional Balinese hut. On the screen, you have the part of conversation when Beth and Ron, the two people who set up the camera, move away from Eva and John. While moving away, she assures them, that Ron and she will return in a short while. In line 4, Beth say, we will return in a short while, or kembali bentar lagi. Then John assures her back in line 5 by saying, yes, no problem, it's gonna be alright even if you guys take a long time. Ya nggak apa-apa, lama juga nggak apa-apa. For Indonesian, you probably can see that John's response in line 5 is just a normal response in this kind of situation. Then John continues his assurance in line 9 by saying, it's even pleasant like this, being a spare for someone else's wife. Or enak lagi begini, nyerap istri orang. In all likelihood, the istri orang or someone else's wife here refers to Eva. She is the only istri orang or someone else's wife relevant to the current situation. Eva seems to have some kind of understanding of John's turn as she repeats the word nyerap, or being spare, in the subsequent turn in line 12. The squiggly line at the beginning and end of Eva's line 12 here represent quivering voice quality. There's a possibility that nyerap is produced together with a suppressed laughter. That's where this quivering quality comes from. But since it's very short, we may not be too sure whether the quivering quality is caused by suppressed laughter. The spare husband's topic, unfortunately, is not pursued afterward, since other topic takes precedence over it. The tail end of John's turn, the one contains nyerap istri orang, or being a spare for someone else's wife in line 10, is produced in overlap with Ron's offer to bring them porridge in line 11. Bawain bubur? Or should we bring you some porridge? The English translation would be, the square bracket on the syllable rang in line 10 and the word bawa in line 11 indicate that they are produced in overlap. The degree sign at the beginning of bronze 10 in line 11 indicates that the 10 is produced in softer volume. In this case, it is because Ron speaks from quite a distance from the camera and voice recorder, so his voice was still discernible but quite faint. A quick background information, back then there was a famous porridge shop just across the park. So the offer to bring some porridge made a perfect sense for the participants because the porridge was good. Subsequently, Eva attempts to run off of the famous porridge and the spare husband talk dissipate, just like that. Or does it? Let's just stay with this nyerep istri orang or being a spare for someone else's wife for a moment. What John says here is actually quite strong, humorous, and highly suggestive. So let's pack it to see the possible inferences or ideas conjured by it. Nyerep, being a spare, is not a productive word in Indonesian language. It is a verb form of the noun serep or spare. The noun serep has limited collocations. It is either occurs as a modifier to kunci or key, or a modifier to ban or tire. Spare key and spare tire are two household objects usually kept aside and only in use in the absence or the failure of the original one. By referring to Eva as a wife, John invokes Eva's gendered identity as a wife, a married female. Through inferences, among other things, the counterpart of a wife and a scene of a married couple may be conjured, not explicitly mentioned, but may be conjured. And John playfully conjured the idea of equating himself to household objects, namely, possibly spare key or spare tire, through the use of the word nyerep. What may be done here is the conjurance of a modified version of a scene of a married couple. But instead of a husband and wife, in the absence of the husband here, what's being conjured is a wife and the spare husband. Through inferences, different ideas of what a wife and the spare husband might do alone in the park may be conjured. Remember in line 9, John says this, that it's even pleasant for some wives and her spare husbands talking about politics, next election, tomorrow's meal are pleasant. For some wives and her spare husbands, other topics may be pleasant. The listeners will just need to fill in the gap. Eva heard this and she repeated the word nyerep or being a spare. In all likelihood, she has some kind of understanding of what John Satran is about, though we may not know for sure what it is. What's happening here is that not in so many words, without so many words, John may have conjured this idea of a wife and her spare husband alone spending pleasant time in the park. You should remember that line 9 is produced in reference to the absence of Beth and Ron in the scene, or Eva and John being left alone. So are the elements of being alone, just the two of them, and pleasant? What's potentially being made relevant here, potentially, way back in the background, are the participants' genders and their potential eligibility for some kind of sexual relationship. Okay, that was the nyerep istri orang or spare husband extract. Now let's continue with our second extract, lonely wife. Lonely wife flirting sequence occurs in less than 1 minute after the spare husband one. Quick background information before we move on with the data. The conversation was recorded in a park, as previously mentioned. The park was located in the vicinity of Eva's parents' house. Eva temporarily moved to this house since her house was under renovation. Her parents' house was only a short walk from the park. They could almost see the house from where they were sitting. And John had never visited Eva's parents' house before when the conversation was recorded back then. The conversation on this slide, line 37 to 40, is only the tail end of Eva's elaborate location demonstration sequence. In line 40, we can see Eva raises her right hand to demonstrate that her parents' house is just a short climb. She says, naik strut, ascend strut. Strut here can be understood as an onomatopoeia for a short climb. We can also see here that slightly earlier in line 39, John has said, oh, or elongated, oh. In this context, it indicates that at this point, John has figured out the way to get to her parents' house, Eva's parents' house. Right, oh, in line 39 without skipping a beat. John says, but when night comes, it's scary, or tapi kalau malam, horror, in line 41. 0.6 second elapses. The silence here is represented by the number 0.6 in line 42. At that time, Eva looks away from John in a puzzling look. Most likely, she probably was still in the mood of trying to explain to John she hasn't realized that John has figured out how to get to her house. So this response, saying about when night comes is scary, came as a surprise, perhaps as a surprise for her. Then in line 43, John tries to elicit response from Eva by quickly raising his chin. Yeah, that's why he tried to elicit. Yeah, after this silence. He raises his chin and eyebrows while saying, While concurrently in line 44, Eva in a soft tone of voice say, horror, or scary, which is a repetition of one of the words in John's earlier turn, line 41. This is when the conversation becomes interesting, because after the repeat, Eva's repeat, horror, because of her repeat, she probably has some kind of understanding of John's turn, why she's repeating it, or she's just trying to make sense of it when she repeated. Then after the repeat, Eva says, but if the escort is unseen, then no problem. Or, tapi kalau yang nganter nggak kelihatan, nggak apa-apa. She started off with a hint of smile, then smile slowly becomes more pronounced. And then at the end of the turn, in line 47, it turns into a giggle. The is a in degree sign at the end of line 47 represents soft giggle, Eva's soft giggle. So we can see a change in Eva's non-verbal from this to this. And then right at the end of Eva's turn in line 17, when she's still giggling, Eva turns his body facing the camera. And then soon after, John looks at the camera, stretching his hand, and then say, viewers, this is a wife who is lonely, or saudara-saudara, inilah istri yang jablai. So what's going on here? What's the giggling is all about? And what's John's doing there, presenting Eva to the camera? First, we have John suddenly, now let's go back to line 41, where this cryptic and playful, humorous conversation part of talk happened. First, we have John suddenly introduce scary and night, right after figuring out how to get to Eva's parents' house. This is an authentic picture on the surrounding area of the park near to Eva's parents' house, taken on the day of data collection. So for Indonesian or Balinese or anyone familiar with Indonesian, Javanese or Balinese folklore, this thick bamboo grove will easily conjure the scene of horror movie. The word used by Johnny in line 41 also seems fitting, because instead of using serem, which means scary, John used horror, potentially making a reference to horror film genre. Then we have Eva smiling and giggling, of course. introducing unseen escort. So she introduced unseen escort by saying, tapi kalau yang nganter nggak kelihatan nggak apa-apa. But if the escort is unseen, then no problem. This is the first time that they mention about escort in this conversation. So let's stay with this term for a while because this is part of the cryptic or confusion too. Let's unpack it. So yang nganter is a headless noun phrase. The closest English translation would be the one who does escorting or keeping company. By mentioning nganter, Eva may also conjure the idea of escorting to safety, keeping a company, etc. So basically, conjuring the scene of two people. One is being protected and accompanied by the other, and from this, at night. Mind you, there are scarcely street lights in the area and public transportation is practically non-existent in the area. At that time, both of the participants knew that Eva had to ride a motorbike by herself to her workplace in the city center, which was around 20-ish kilometers away from this place. She often had to return to work late at night by herself, passing through this horrorness, possibly, to get to her parents' place. And there's another piece of information which may be relevant, is that John usually drives a car. Now let's talk about why the escort need to be unseen or invisible to not cause any problem. This can mean so many things, but among so many other possibilities, we may consider that Eva is a married female who currently lives in her parents' house. What's more, this house is located in Eva's parents' home village, the place where her parents was born. Her father was born, where everybody knows everybody. Then among many different possibilities, she may suggest that the escorting activity is clandestine in nature and possibly at night, which is in line with John's suggestion. And also, as the participants know, that John usually drives a car. So it's possible for the escort to be unseen. In this sense, the escort would be driving Eva's home. The driver, is possible the driver to be unseen because he just stayed in the car. Does this remind us of some scene conjured in the less than 1 minute ago, the spare husband? The reality here is co-constructed. The spare husband scene is probably still in the air. And here, John brings the scary and night elements, and then Eva brings in a reference to an escort, and then using if clause construction indicating that the person who does the accompanying need to be unseen or invisible. Provided by their intimate knowledge of one another, such as the distance between Eva's parents' house to her work, how she usually gets home from work, how John normally drives a car, etc. The scene starts to take more shape in the background. John's mention about scary at night right after John's mention about scary at night right after Eva directs him on how to get to her parents' house indirectly hints that it is about Eva. So when Eva makes a reference to escort and escorting activity, the listeners are guided to think that it is about her. And at least for that moment, the turn is produced in the viewership of John. So perhaps it is not that far-fetched to think that the escort may be John among other possibilities. What's more, everything fits together. The situation, what they say, and also the background information that they know about one another. So it makes sense, at least for them. For us, it makes sense after we have those pieces of information about the possible knowledge or background knowledge about one another, the biographical information about one another, and also the knowledge about Indonesian, Balinese, and their cultural background. Now let's move on to the aftermath. Does it get clear now for us why John says, viewer, this is a lonely wife, or saudara-saudara inilah seorang istri yang jablai? Okay, before going deeper into this, let's talk about jablai. What is it? Jablai is an acronym derived from ja, the shortened form of jarang or rarely in English, and blai, the shortened form of belai or caressed. So the acronym jablai literally means rarely caressed. When John said istri yang jablai, the most literal translation would be a wife who is rarely caressed. And this rarely caressed make a good relation or characterization related, or not really good, probably we can just say that it's relevant based on what they know about one another. It's relevant to Eva's real life situation, at least one facet of her real life situation. Then there is this 2006 Indonesian drama comedy movie titled Mendadak Dangdut. One of the soundtrack of the movie is titled Jablai. Because of its success, it adds humor to the word jablai, and it brings jablai to the mainstream Indonesian culture. In the movie soundtrack, jablai is depicted as a tacky singer who was abandoned by her husband. She sung from one small event to another, dressed up and act up in this like tacky and flirtatious way. So here is an example. We have the Titi Kamal, the actress, who in her jablai outfit in the movie and soundtrack. This depiction adds some humor nuances to the word jablai and makes it culturally more acceptable to be used in everyday conversation, since the word jablai may also mean slut or prostitute, which are not acceptable for teasing or directly addressing someone in day-to-day, everyday conversation. So our question is then, why John refers to Eva as seorang istri yang jablai at this point in time, right after Eva playfully mentioned escort, unseen escort. Why seorang istri, a wife, and not any other kinds of reference for Eva? Other than wife, she may have other kinds of identities. Because of those identities, she may be able to. She can be called, she can be referred as or characterized as other things. Among other possibilities, John's seorang istri yang jablai or lonely wife is a reference, or his analysis reflects his analysis of what just happened. It reveals his understanding of what Eva has just done in line 46 and 47. Possibly the mention of an escort that needs to be unseen is a hush-hush tip for a lonely wife to a potential pengantar or accompanying person. But there are many different possibilities. However, John's response possibly hints to this one. What's possibly going on here is that if we are talking about gender or gender, it creeps slowly, moment by moment. The gendered scene is conjured jointly by the participants. Prior to talking about this, prior to this whole scary at night, we still remember that Eva was giving direction to John. So it's at that point, it's like what's relevant is that a person who knows about location giving a direction to a person who doesn't know about the place. Yeah, and then there's nothing gendered when John says, at least from the look of it, tapi kalau malam horror, but when night comes, it's scary, in line 41. Or is it? We do not know for sure. The participants may see it as gender, may see it as a way of invoking gender, but we don't know. At least from the look of it, there's nothing gendered there. Though we need to remember as well that the nyerap istri orang, the whole scene of being spare husband, was just mentioned, was just conjured in less than 1 minute ago. John may orient to that, and he's making vague reference to that, but we don't know for sure, at least from this what he says here. Then when Eva says, tapi kalau yang nganter nggak kelihatan, nggak apa-apa. for Bifty. But if the escort is unseen, then no problem in line 46, 47. Is this gendered? There's nothing gendered here in the term per se. I mean, in terms of its word choice, there's nothing gendered here. But seeing how this, at least for Eva, as a fitting response to John, conjuring horror at night, it may be gendered, possibly among other things, as what we explained before. You know, why ngantar in relation to scariness and horror, and in relation to Eva's Eva's going home at late at night by herself on a motorbike and no street lights, and why it has to be unseen, relevant to how John usually drives. So being unseen is possible, and how Eva is a married person who lives in her parents' house, where the house is located in her father's village, where everybody's know everybody. So like the whole background information. It may be gendered. It may be implicating themselves, the two of them, but it's not explicit. At last, when John refers to Eva as a lonely wife, he specifically refers to her in her gendered identity, a wife. It's very clear. In line 46 and 47, we may only see that the participant, may be implicated, but here it's clear. John is referring to Eva as a lonely wife. And this identity, this playful identity or reference, may reveal how John may have understood what is going on in line 46 and 47. So gender creeps, even though that there was nothing gendered in line 41, 46, and 47, but based on John's response, we may see that there might be gender, or at least John understands it or characterizes it, that there's something gendered there in line 46 and 47. Gender creeps in from way in the background, way back, and then slowly taking a shape, and the foregrounded in line 50 and 52 through John's reference to lonely wife, referring Eva as lonely wife. Though this characterization or lonely wife is not the main business, because here John is actually doing what we may characterize as TV presenter pretend play. He presents Eva as a guest and depicting her playfully as a lonely wife. Another thing that is going on here is, in slightly in the background, the subtext, if we may say, is that noticing that Eva has just probably being a lonely wife. She may have just in line 56 and 46 and 47, she may have just tipped a potential escort how to best accompany her at night to her parents' house. And line 50 and 52 is John simply calling her out for her action, or he noticed her action, noticed what Eva's doing, and then he's calling her out for that. So let me recap. A person may have multitude of identities and roles in real life, but not all are relevant in all given conversation, given in all part of talk. And the participants need to do some action to make some of those identities relevant. And in some case, the identities may not be there at all. You know, a wife who is okay to have a spare husband may or may not be Eva's real identity, but that one is being constructed here. Because we know that when it comes to flirting, the relevant identities are first and foremost gender. and the other identities that enables them to be a couple. Together, the gender and other identities are courtship enabling identities, those identities that enable courtship. The gender identities here are male and female in Eva and John's case. John and Eva are heterosexual, and they oriented their heterosexuality during the course of their flirting interaction. The gender identities relevant for non-heterosexual potential couple will be different than the one we have here. So talking about other courtship enabling identities, here we can see the participant's sensitivity to Eva's married status. So they make that status relevant. Instead of passing it on, they make that status relevant and then negotiate it. Yeah, so what's on the table for here is not only the participant's gender identity, though that is the base, but also Eva's identity as a married female who is open for a relationship. We may not know whether she's open or not, but that very one is the one being contested here, proffered, and negotiated. And for John, it is probably a single male who is willing to be a setup or a spare, just like a spare key or spare tire that needs to be shelved or keeps when the main key or tire is available. And the spare is used in the absence of the main one. These identities are proffered, invoked, and negotiated. They are not set in stone. They are being made relevant in the talk for some use. In this case, it's for flirting. But at the same time, on a different level, the identities are not done, are non-final. They are also being negotiated. How ready Eva is to have a setup or spare husband is also being negotiated. At first, it's being proffered and then invoked, etc. So in other parts of, I only presented two flirting sequences, but in other parts of the flirting data, in other flirting extracts or flirting sequences in the data, the same thing happened. This kind of identity is invoked first and then negotiated by the participants. So this is one of the things that's happened in the flirting. It's about exploring and opening up the possibility of being a couple. Whether the participant is intending to be a couple or not is a different matter. But their partaking and their willingness to attend or even ratify those identities that enabling them to have some kind of a couple, idea to be a couple, may be understood to in relationship to their willingness to be involved romantically or sexually. Now we may expand this pattern perhaps and ponder for us. Okay, this is an extra activity outside of the data. For us, what could be those identities that need to be put on the table to open up for courtship possibility? Our courtship enabling identities that we may proffer and negotiate with our participants. So we may think of a lonely, single writer, attractive, middle-aged, a bright student who need a companion, etc. For those who do not want to open up for potential relationship, you can make sure that you do not bring those identities to the table in interaction. So for other participants to attend, those are your vulnerable spots. This is for discussion later. We can talk more about this. Whether you can see in a clear picture now how, for example, workplace affair, inadvertent sexual advancement happens. So this kind of identity, courtship enabling identities is also one of the thing relevant in pre-courtship or courtship. And now for those who want to open up for potential relationship, you can try to invoke courtship enabling identities in your interaction with potential mate. It's one of the keys to successful flirting. There are still some others, for example, on how to weave those identities subtly into the conversation. or how to make a stepwise transition to flirting from non-flirting talk, but that's for a different presentation. So to close up, I hope today we have a quick glimpse on how flirting is actually done. Yeah, so flirting is being used here for as an umbrella term for this kind of activity that we have seen before. For some, it may simply be being friendly or bantering. Yeah, but the thing about today's data is that it's not through recall or simulation, so we know for sure what's the flirting. What kind of flirting is that? Even though that flirting is an umbrella term, it may refer to so many things. Because we have the data here that we can observe how the participants are actually doing it, so we know what we mean by flirting in this data. From that, I hope that we can take home this lesson on how to flirt, especially on how to bring up courtship enabling identities, the identities most relevant to opening up possibility for courtship, and how they are invoked, they are negotiated, they are proffered, they are ratified, passed on, etc. I hope you also learn how to not to flirt on doing any inadvertent sexual advances. I hope from today's presentation we add our knowledge, even for a bit, on how to manage and take more control of our sexual moves and advances in our interaction. So this is the selected references. Let me know if you need to know more on the references on any of the aspects of today's presentation. Actually skipped all references to the literature, but what I did today, the analysis, is not standing by itself. It's based on previous works on CA, MCA, conversation analysis, membership categorization analysis, sociology, anthropology, discourse analysis, social linguistic, etc. So thank you very much for listening, and